Very uncharacteristic for me. I've got to stay chained here, and I'm a walker-talker, sort of like a roving farm animal. I would have been back and forth and talking to y'all, but there's no lapel mic, so I've got to stay here. Very much not my style. What is my style, and y'all are, I have to confess, a little bit intimidating. I was asked to do the retirement ceremony of the Chief Justice of the Second Circuit a couple of years ago. And I walk in, and by mandatory performances, every judge in the entire Second Circuit of the United States, and for those of you who are in the legal field, you know that's the feeder to the Supreme Court. You know, 5 or 6 people in that room will be Supreme Court justices, or at least in that discussion. That was an intimidating group. And I feel a little bit the same this morning. There's so much experience here. There's so much wisdom here. I want to learn from y'all. I do have a really important, my next book is something that I want to sort of talk to y'all about in week 3 or 4, and I'm going to get your help to do it. Y'all are going to help me work on this book. Enough time. What I do, my style is very interactive and very engaging. So we got plenty of time for questions. But what I don't want to do is just spin out hypotheticals all day long and all night, because I do have some stuff, a whole bunch of stuff I want to talk to y'all. But it's a waste of my time and a waste of your time if I come and talk to you about what I want to talk about, not what you want to talk about. So what we're going to do today, that's the point of this slide, is just to say, ask questions. But make them pointed. Try not to make long statements, because I want to ask your questions, but I know that there are other questions and other issues. Okay? We're going to do some complex stuff, and we're going to do some easy stuff. So I don't know which is which to you all, unless you let me know, okay? And ordinarily, I'd be wandering around looking at the looks on your faces, but I can't do that because I'm stuck here, okay? I want to set a little bit up for you. You know, Kunduz has been in the news. Have y'all seen the news, the whole Kunduz incident where they bombed the Médecins Sans Frontières hospital? I've been doing media on that all week. One of the things that you've got to understand is the ethos, the professional ethos of what all this law war stuff is about. It's not just about New York Times op-eds. It's not just about the kinds of headlines, the kinds of problems you have. This is George Marshall. Anybody VMI graduate? Yeah. Well, faculty, that counts. George Marshall, VMI guy, the chief of staff in World War II, really one of the most humble. The brainchild of World War II was George Marshall. George Marshall was a young second lieutenant in the Philippines right after he got out of VMI. So where's a leader? Somebody that was a leader of an organization, raise your hand. Somebody that had a position of power and authority, raise your hand, because I'm going to put you on the spot. Who are you?
Jerry Brock.
Jerry Brock?
Brock.
Did I hear that right?
Yeah.
And what was your position of power and authority? All right, so a TI tech goober. All right. But a boss, a jefe. So George Marshall is a young second lieutenant. He's out on his combat patrol in the counterinsurgency of the Philippines, jungle warfare, ambushes. You know, we think about ISIS in Iraq. You know, lots of ambushes, jungle warfare. Very first combat patrol. And by the way, footnote, if you don't think training and education is important, the Hamdaniya massacre, or the Haditha massacre in the U.S. Marine Corps happened on that young lieutenant's first combat patrol. Very first time out the chute. Same thing for George Marshall. They get to a river crossing, and one of his soldiers yells, "Crocodile." Of course, there's no crocodiles down there, but he yells crocodile. So everybody scrambles out of the water. Now, what do you do, jefe, when you get to the far side? It's obvious they're just playing with you. It's just a joke. What are you going to do, George?
Send them back.
Say again?
I'd send them back.
Why? Did you ever hear what he said? Send them back. What are your options? Option 1, you know, it's clear they're all making fun of you. You're the brand new young lieutenant, going to send them back. What's your first option? What would most of y'all do?
Run.
Why run? No, you're not going to run. They're standing there laughing at you. They're all with water falling. They're going to stand and laugh at you. You're being humiliated. What are you going to do, most of you? Yeah, the mom says, I'm going to scold. That's what most human reaction is, to get angry at some degree. Well, what's the problem with laughing with them? Somebody said laugh. What's the problem with laughing with them? How many folks vote laugh with them? No hands. Well, you're a brave pioneer. How many folks vote yell at them? Scold them? You got to vote now. Come on, bunch of pickles. Scold them, yell at them. What's the problem with that approach? You just created distance and a sense of, that's not leadership. All you're doing is yelling and exerting authority, and in fact, you're undermining your real authority by standing on this fake exercise of authority. What's the problem with laughing at them?
They win.
Or laughing, yeah, they win, exactly. You just wasted whatever moral and legal authority you had, and you're supposed to be in command in a combat zone. Now, this man had good instincts. What did you say first? Right, perfect answer. And you didn't learn that in school. Send him back. Why?
Because you're in charge.
You're in charge. What George Marshall did was classic, and I teach this in leadership schools. He formed them up on the far side just like they were on a parade ground. And in the military, how many folks served? How many veterans we got? Y'all know what I'm talking about. You preach it to these other people. Thank you for your service. Formed them up just like they were on a parade ground. They did a weapons inspection. They did an accountability inspection. Everybody got their gear and their night vision goggles. And formed them up just like on a parade field, marched them back to the other side. Just like you were on a counter column march. Okay? Got them on the where they first started. Did the same thing. Weapons inspection, inspection in ranks, just order, drill, just like you were on a parade ground. Marched them across the river. Did it 15 times. What's the message? What's the message? Number one, I'm in charge. Number one, I'm in charge. Number two, and most importantly, this is the ethos I want you to get. While I'm in charge, there's a right way and a wrong way to do business. We're going to be professional. We're going to be disciplined. There's a right way to cross a river in a combat zone, and if you screw it up, no offense, you get people killed. And while I'm here, it's my responsibility to do things correctly. Folks, that's the essence of this law of war we're going to talk about, okay, in a nutshell. So here's kind of my view of the 6 weeks, although in truth, I kind of see y'all taking it other places. We'll see how that evolves. So this week, I just want to give you a big picture overview of what some of the concepts look like. Some of the vocabulary, some of the concepts. I suspect you'll see the Kunduz reporting in a slightly different light from now on, from this moment on. Next week, I want to do targeting, sort of a detailed look at the law of targeting and human shields, an increasing problem in our world. You know, you look at every modern combat situation, whether you're talking about Hamas or the Tamil Tigers in Sri Lanka, or you name it, is using human shields. ISIS in Mosul has turned the entire city of Mosul into one giant human shield. They've dug almost medieval trenches around Mosul. So the entire city is, people are being prevented from leaving, etc. Then I want to do something fairly technical and legalistic, but very interesting because it's really emblematic of the big problems we've got, which is the law of human rights. Human rights versus the law of war. This matters in dramatic ways. Okay, how many folks saw the recent report came out in July from the UN Human Rights Council accusing Israel of having committed war crimes in Gaza in 2014? Anybody see that press reported? The basis of that report, when you look at it, it's entirely written from the human rights basis. Fine, but that's the wrong body of law. See? And there's a technical reason why they wrote it from that way. I happen to disagree with it. They're wrong as a technical matter. But that then flavors and colors all of your legal reactions, you see. So we're going to do that and think about the effects that's had on the way we, particularly counterinsurgency, the way we do counterinsurgency law. We're going to do drones the following week. Drones and autonomous weapons, that's easy. You'll enjoy that. Then we're going to do some coalition warfare. You know, if we're going to try to, in ISIS in Syria today, you're seeing these issues. In Afghanistan, we've seen lots of those issues. Iraq, lots of examples. Changing the way we look at rules of engagement and the way we fight. And the last week, I thought we would do a little bit of accountability. What do investigations look like? What does the International Criminal Court process look like? Some of that stuff, although I call it grab bag. Because last week we're just going to play Stump the Chump, and I'll let you all ask questions, and you know, we'll see where that goes. I did on the website recommend these books, and I'm not mercenary, but these books got a whole lot more background. This is the hardcover. It's more expensive, and if you're poverty-stricken, I'll buy one for you. but the print's bigger, so I like that. This, the paperback, it's cheaper, but the print's smaller. The way they did the online, how many folks are using Kindles now and app? Yeah, I like these because you can move the print, and you can change the colors, and you can do all that. I was adamant in the contract that the online book looks exactly like the print book. Same page numbers, same everything. So I like the way they've done that. So here's our goals kind of for the long haul. You want to get the law right. But more importantly, if you know the law, if you're some technical legal robot, y'all aren't going to be international lawyers. What I want you to do is understand the linkage between law and policy. The second big goal of these 6 weeks is when you see media reports, you're going to understand them in a very different light. You're going to very quickly be able to say, well, wait a minute, they're leaving this out. They're not. You got to answer that question. What do we not know? That's what you're going to get. And then lastly is to understand operational tactical options. The way we put this stuff on the ground with human shields or counterinsurgency or battling ISIS or retaking Mosul or making a decision to launch a drone strike, etc. This stuff really matters in the real world. I suspect some of y'all are most of y'all probably are very, very well read. This is Vattel. Somebody did a listing of the top 30 books in the colonial libraries, and Vattel was on that list. The Founding Fathers read Vattel. It was, I think, number 19 on the list, depending on, just by numbers. Vattel's principles, literally straight out of him, he influences things like the Declaration of Independence and so many other ways of colonial thinking. Vattel had a lot to say about the law of war, believe it or not, and a lot to say about the principles that today, some 500 years later, we've embedded in all of this law and all this practice. So if you imagine, we've got this very old, ancient body of law and principles, but the overlay for that is a dramatically new set of technologies, things like drones, autonomous weapons, cyber war. We'll do a little bit of cyber war. And the question is, how do those two things fit together? You've got a 500- or 600-year-old body of law, and the short answer is awkwardly. And we'll explain that, and you'll get a good sense of what that looks like. Okay? A little bit of history lesson for you first, and then we'll do some law. Y'all recognize George Washington, and you recognize our current occupant of the Oval Office. What's George Washington got to do with ISIS? Everything. Some of y'all may not remember this. And I'm trusting none of y'all were actually there. Yes, ma'am. Good. Well, that's right. George Washington said, beware of entangling alliances in his farewell address, and he was projecting ahead in his belief that America would be a great country and would have the capacity to be engaged in great alliances. I agree totally, but there's something more fundamental. If you've read the Constitution lately, you know that we have one commander-in-chief. We have one jefe, one presidente. That's a historical accident because there were many people in the Continental Congress and many people at the Constitutional Convention and arguing for a co-presidency. And it's related to the foreign entanglement point because people were worried about a chief executive that would drag us into war. In the language of Ben Franklin was one of the key leaders of this movement. He called it a president who would be too fond of war and therefore drag us around all over the place. So the idea was, let's have two as another check in the process. The reason we don't have two today is, as some of y'all know, George Washington was chairing the Constitution. They looked at George Washington, understanding he's going to be the first president. And when you looked at the character of George Washington, nobody in the room could compellingly argue, yes, we need two co-presidents because we can't trust the president. We can't trust his discretion, his integrity, or her integrity, right? Her desire to put the national interest above self-interest. That's why we have one. The challenge, though, is that the Constitution says the president does what? It's commander-in-chief. The Congress declares war, not makes war. The original draft said makes war. Can you imagine what a mess we'd be in if we were relying on Congress to do everything? Goodness, they can't find the bathroom on time. You know? So making war in that setup was a functional impossibility. So today we live in a world where the president makes war or engages us overseas, but there's a huge debate about the normative content of what law and the mechanics of how to do that. Okay? So you get things like, you know, Lyndon Johnson sitting in the Oval Office picking out targets over Vietnam. That's policy, that's not law. Okay? You get things like the CIA bringing in President Obama's daily intelligence brief. You know, you saw the press reporting about the drone list and that's not law, that is policy. Okay? And to the extent that there's this overlap between policy that people begin to think of as legal constraints, functionally we begin to change the law. Because for the guy on the ground, they don't care. Right? For them, it's just that's what they have to do, and they're going to do it, and they're going to do it to the best of their ability, and that's it. We'll come back next week. I just wanted to tee up for you, though, the difference between these two big bodies of law. Jus ad bellum is what President Washington was talking about foreign entanglements. Jus ad bellum, anybody been to Venice? Yeah, see, y'all traveled. So imagine the bridge over the canal in Venice. Big deep canals are not that deep at low tide, but you still got to get across. Okay? The classic thing in Venice is somebody with a tourist suitcase, boom, 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 up 6 stairs, across the bridge, boom, 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 down 6 stairs. Go 100 yards, boom, 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 over and down, boom, 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 boom. That's jus ad bellum, the body of law that carries us from a time of peace into a time of war. And to foreshadow what we're going to do in a couple of weeks, in time of peace, human rights law, fully applicable. In time of war, obviously we have displaced human rights law, like putting a tennis ball into a glass. We've displaced some of that law and replaced it with law of war. That process is very much, it's a jump ball today as we sit here. And it matters enormously on the ground. Put this in the Kunduz situation. Under the law of war, in the hospital, when there's a report of fire coming from the ground, and it's you know, the Afghans call for fire, under the law of war, the only question is it a lawful target? Am I attacking it in a lawful way in conjunction, in compliance with my rules of engagement? No problem. Under human rights law, if you're not taking fire at the moment you return fire, it's unlawful. You see, it matters what body of law applies. And we're going to do checkpoints, we're going to do some counterinsurgency, I'm going to talk you through that. Jus ad bellum is the body of law that carries you from one piece of legal principle to the other. Once you're on the other side, then what we're going to spend most of our time doing, and particularly today, is dealing in the mechanics of how you fight. In other words, what you do lawfully as a matter of law or policy. Okay? Now, quick question. I promised you questions. Who's totally concerned at this point? I don't understand what's going on. Everybody happy? Y'all should smile if you're happy. All right. So the key difference here, and I just wrote an entire book on this. I don't have time to give you all the stuff in the book, but I do want to sort of highlight you to one big concept, because this is my way of introducing you to the biggest difference between those two bodies of law. The biggest difference between those two bodies of law is that human rights law is restrictive. In other words, in human rights law, when you do something to somebody else, you must you bear the burden of proof, and you must find an affirmative authority for justifying whatever it is you're going to do. It's restrictive in that sense. Okay? Law of armed conflict is exactly the opposite. It's a permissive body of law. Now, I know some of y'all have difficulty hearing, right? Don't hear me to be saying that in the law of war you can do whatever you want to do because it's permissive. That's not what I'm saying. In the law of war, it's permissive in that it builds in a big range of discretion and deference and a big zone of permissible action subject only to the outer boundaries of what's prohibited. You see the difference? It's like a photographic negative. Human rights law, you may only do something when you have specific authorization, and only to the extent that it's specifically authorized. When you have a specific legal policy reason that justifies, and you bear the burden of proof. You see that? That's restrictive. It means I can't act unless I can find some. Law of war, exactly the opposite. I'm presumed to have autonomy to act, deference, discretion to act, unless there's a prohibition. Photographic negatives of each other. And you see that in the definition of proportionality. I'm going to read the definition and you tell me who's making this determination. You may not intentionally launch an attack in the knowledge that you're going to cause suffering, injury to non-combatants or civilians. This is Kunduz, folks. This is Kunduz. This is the hospital. Even if the Afghans called and said, they're under fire, would you please help us? This is the applicable principle. Okay? And the question is, dadgummit, you can't read the bottom of that because their thing is messed up. I'll read it. I'll tell you what it says. The other one working? Same thing. All right, so what it says is that you can't do it unless it's if it's clearly excessive in relation to the concrete and direct overall military advantage, and the key word is anticipated. So even if you're wrong, in fact, what counts for legal purposes is your assessment at the time based on the information you reasonably have available to you. Does that make sense? Yes, sir.
During the Second World War, there were concerns in the bombing of Europe about churches and historical monuments. How would you relate, how was the determination made about which churches?
The law changed and we're going to do it next week. You got to have a real military purpose. We're going to do that next week. And we're also going to do, a lot of people, every time I talk in this field, somebody's a World War II aficionado and they talk about Dresden and Tokyo and the fire bombings. Y'all probably wonder about that. We're going to do it next week. Short answer is the law changed after World War II in response to that. Okay? But you see, this is a permissive rule. Who's making that determination? Yes, sir. I don't do hypos. I do I'll answer questions. I'm not going to let 5-minute hypos.
Okay. If you are in a combat situation
Mm-hmm.
and you are leading an A-team, let's say, and you're ambushed, and there is a church there.
Absolutely. No problem.
Then you don't have a JAG officer on your...
I don't want you to have a JAG officer. What I want...
You have the code of conduct.
There's those folks.
Right.
There's no JAGs out there. There's no heavy-duty book. I can bring you the Department of Defense Law War Manual next week. It's 1,200 pages, about this big.
So that A-team commander is not thinking of...
That's right.
What law is this?
These guys aren't thinking about law.
Right.
They better not be. I don't want them thinking about Article 54 of the Hague Conventions of 1907. I want them doing what they're trained to do. That's why it's a permissive body of law. Okay? It builds in all the discretion that a warfighter needs to lawfully accomplish their mission. So if you hear somebody saying, you cannot do that, you're prohibited from doing that in a war zone, the logical question for you is, what's the source of the prohibition? Is it a legal source? If so, let's look at it. Was it applied properly, etc.? Was it a policy source, or was it constrained? And he's exactly right. I can't read your name. George? George. Good eyes, man. The question then is, because these people are not lawyers. So that's the point. The body of law of war is designed for them to apply and them to apply it correctly when they follow their training. So what I want you to understand is, just like George Marshall, there's a right way and a wrong way to do business, and the law of war is what gives you, as I say it, the professional ethos. Y'all came from professions, didn't you? Right? How many folks are professionals? Yeah, what kind of professionals? We got some doctors, I know. You got a professional code and a licensing and all that. We got, what other kind of professionals we got here? Psychologists. Psychologists, whoa, heavy-duty professional. Lots of rules, lots of stuff there. Professional code, professional ethics, professional ethos. What other kind of professions we got here? Teachers, engineers. You see what I'm getting at? For the warfighter, the law of war is your professional ethos. From that comes things like duty, professionalism, integrity, investigations. So when you hear, by the way, this is my, can I get on my soapbox for just a second? in Kunduz, when you hear people saying we have to have an independent investigation to find out what happened in Kunduz, it ought to sort of make the hair on the back of your neck stand up. Because who's responsible for the discipline and the professionalism and the compliance of that unit when it's in a war zone with the way they do? Whose job is that? That's the commander's job. It is not the job of the Red Cross or some non-governmental agency out there or some bunch of do-gooders that just wants to come in and oversee. That's the commander's job. The second you take away investigative authority and punitive authority from the commander, what you've effectively done is gutted the entire law war. You've made it just theory. And the point is, these guys are not thinking about the law of war. They're thinking about their mission. They're thinking about each other. The law of war is operating, but it's like, I know y'all are high tech now. It's like the Windows operating system on your computer. Right? You're not dabbling in the software to change your Windows operating, but it's always there. It's always operating. And the point is, you cannot do what you are supposed to do without that running in the backdrop. That's the way I want you to think about the law of war. Okay? And the problem is that the mission always changes and the context changes, and all of a sudden I got human shields. I didn't have to deal with human shields in World War II, except for very rare isolated instances. Now I got to deal with them every day on patrol. I didn't have to figure out drones or autonomous weapons in World War II. I do now. Okay? Now there are some things that stay the same, and we'll talk about those throughout. The other big thing is that the commander, because the commander is ultimately responsible for mission accomplishment in accordance with the law, it logically follows that it's that commander's duty, whether he likes that soldier or not, or Marine, or, you know, nurse, or whatever they're dealing with, the disciplinary function flows from that. Okay? And we can talk about the court-martial system at some point, or the way other countries do it, etc. And as I've already said this, it's a radically changed environment. Today we've got cyber war threats, we got social media. Most of the ISIS federal cases where we've prosecuted ISIS for material support to terrorism have been generated by Facebook postings and Twitter postings. Okay, so if you're sitting here contemplating going to Syria to join ISIS, I wouldn't put it on Facebook. Okay? The feds will be there real fast. Okay? Just a quick update on the situation on the ground in Syria, which, you know, is in the news so much, follows our backdrop. These are the basic areas, and I can post these slides. If you email me, I'll email you all this stuff. No need to write it down. But that's basically what the country looks like. Big pockets split between the Alawites on the coast and the Russian influence on the coast. The Russians want that port up there. They want to preserve that Russian naval base. The middle band of the country is essentially controlled by ISIS, mostly because you think about common sense. You got the Kurds controlling the north and the Turkish PKK militia controlling the north. You got the Alawites in the south and west. In that middle, you're going to have some uncertainty and some turbulence. Okay? And that's the area where ISIS took control. Just on the other side of the border, here's Iraq. Same thing. Shiite in the south, Kurd in the north. The Sunni band in the west, very much in dispute. And that's where ISIS is most active. This is Mount Sinjar, where you probably remember the big battle back last fall when ISIS was taking Sinjar and the Kurds were pushing them out. This is where the Yazidi genocide happened and the Yazidi Kurds fled. Key question, though, at the time was, why in the world don't we just bomb them out of existence? Right? What you don't know is if you look across the bottom, there's the mountain, and across the bottom is a main road. That's their, in military parlance, what they call a main supply route. That's the road between Raqqa and Mosul. How do you think ISIS got to Mosul? Down that road. Okay? So if we'd been serious about warfighting and applied the law correctly, we would have said if it's on that road, shoot it. Unless it's a civilian or clearly not a lawful target. If it's on that road, shoot it. And we didn't do it. That's how ISIS got to Mosul. Literally down there. When I was in Kurdistan, I had people begging me, go back and tell the U.S. military to bomb the road. I came back and I told them, bomb the road. They said, well, we know that. But we're not allowed to bomb the road. And I said, well, why not? They said, too long to talk and it's classified anyway. Again, the point is this disconnect between law and policy. You got to think about precisely where that boundary breaks down. This is Fallujah. This is beginning to hint on your earlier question. Here's a bunch of mosques in Fallujah. When the Marines are retaking Fallujah during the Iraq War, and we know that all of these mosques are being used as fighting positions and unlawfully used to shield combatant activities, the question is, do you just go in and destroy all the mosques? Some you do, some you don't. And it's a very particularized question each and every time, on each and every target. Okay? Same thing here. Now, who wants to play commander? I know some of y'all like to talk. Who likes to talk? Who wants to play commander?
Can you back up and just give me an example of what might cause us to destroy one mosque versus not another?
The relative military parlance, go back to the rule of proportionality, which says I can't do something that's clearly excessive, the anticipated damage to a mosque or a civilian apartment or any other protected target, clearly excessive in relation. So the balancing, the scales, if you think of it as a scale, on the one hand I've got the amount of damage I'm going to cause to something that I don't want to damage or that I can't lawfully damage. What's on the other side? The military necessity. So if I find the mosque where all of the key leadership of the insurgency is and it's a weapons depot, odds are I want to destroy that place. If I find the mosque with, as in the Monte Casino, a guy in the minaret using it as a sniper's nest, I don't destroy the whole mosque.
And as a practical matter, I'm just curious, are those decision criteria being documented at the time in case they're needed later?
They're documented typically. It all happens fast. There's two ways it happens. One is you saw my Marines running across the bridge. It can happen extremely quickly. Kunduz happened very, very quickly. That's why you've got to remember that the law of armed conflict is intended to be a permissive body of law. It gives you a broad breadth of discretion, okay, when you're applying it in good faith. That's the key. Many other targets, and we'll do this next week. Next week I'm going to talk you through what a deliberate targeting process looks like. When we have time, when we do it deliberately, much more complicated. And frankly, how many lawyers we got in here? Too many dang lawyers. I'm one, I've done that. But I had a commander one time, and what he did was he was convinced that this process was so labor intensive and so important to get it right, he literally painted feet on the floor. And he said, until every staff member is here, and the problem was the lawyer had big feet. You know, he wasn't going to make those decisions without a lawyer walking him through and talking him through every step. And next week I'm going to show you all the body of law that applies to how you do that. Okay? All right. Real quick, I'm going to spend about a minute doing this. This is a good example. You're in the air. This is your UAV. This is your drone. You just learned that that white car pulled up. It's got a key Syrian ISIS commander. Pretend he's an ISIS guy. Hit it, not hit it. What do you say? Where's my leader?
Hit it.
Everybody says hit it? Well, what's the problem? It's a residential area, or it looks like a residential area, which then makes you turn to your engineer or your intel guy and say, is that a residential area? Or in fact, is that a field hospital? See, one of the problems in Kunduz ought to have been that NATO has pre-positioned 10-digit grid coordinates of where field hospitals are. Very simple. You just punch that grid in the computer and you say, is this a designated no-target area? It's one of the things you've got to do. Why? Because you bear the responsibility for complying with the law here. Our instinct says hit it every time. But the warfighter says, well, wait a minute. I've got to do it right. What's the other thing you might want to know? I'm sorry? Okay, who else might be around that might change in some way my thing? I might want to know, for example, if there's a bunch of human shields in there. You know, one of the reasons in Afghanistan that the Taliban consistently, we keep hearing these press reports, you can Google this, the U.S. keeps bombing weddings. Really stupid. But one of the things that's going on is you got a huge number of combatants congregated in the middle of a wedding or just off a wedding. What's the press look like when we do that? Horrible. But in fact, it could be a lawful target. You have got to articulate that. And you've got to apply the law correctly. Okay, quick question.
How precise is your weapon?
How precise? What weapon am I going to use? What angle of attack am I going to use? We'll do all this next week. What I want you to understand is it's not so simple. It's easy for NPR, I mean, if you listen to NPR yesterday morning about Kunduz, it's easy for them to say, had to have been a war crime. Not necessarily. You need to take a deeper, more cautious look at the underlying set of facts and really figure out, did they change the weapon? Did you have time to change the weapon? Were you taking fire? What's the legal rubric? And we're going to talk about the details next week on this. This is what it looks like in practice. You've got this very complex interrelationship, legal norms, operational mandates, and then lastly your intelligence, what the available information. Now intelligence can be wrong. How many folks remember bombing the Chinese embassy in Kosovo? Intelligence can be really wrong. I can tell you because I participated in that targeting decision. I was one of the lawyers that worked that target. I'll tell you, we did it by the book. Bad information. See? So then the question is, are you doing enough to cross-check your information? What's your information flow look like? Did somebody have the right information but just not transmit it to the person who had the right information? Kunduz. I guarantee you there was somebody in NATO that knew that was a field hospital. And the question for me is the information flow and the targeting process within NATO being implemented in a way that guarantees the right information gets to the right people at the right time? Because when you don't do that, problems and mistakes happen. Okay? And I had a slide in here somewhere of the command and control bunker in the first Gulf War, the Alferdus bunker. We hit it. Turned out Baghdad was using that as the top 2 or 3 floors were a command and control center. We knew that. What we didn't know was that the bottom 4 floors underground were being used by the leading Baathists to protect their families. We killed a whole bunch of civilians just not knowing it. And the question is not only what you knew, but what you should have known in order to show due diligence and good faith compliance with all this body of law. Does that make sense?
Would that have changed?
I think it would have. I think it would have. Getting back to her question. If we'd known there were all those civilians there, you don't hit it with a bunker buster bomb. You know? Your goal is to destroy the utility of the command center, so maybe you hit it with surface weapons. Maybe you just destroy the towers. There's lots of other ways of accomplishing the same thing, provided that you're trying to do it in good faith. No? Okay. Is there a question there? Very shortly.
No, I just said that's what the Russians did when they hit the elementary school last week in my town in Syria. They thought it's ISIS. ISIS is not in this area.
Yeah, there's...
Civilian people.
They are. One of the things, and I think this is what she's referring to, one of the pieces of information that's now surfacing, got to be careful in this digital age. The Russians are going out and saying, we hit this target, we hit this target, we hit this target. There's a private entrepreneur website guy now that's gone back and tracked with 10-digit grids, so what you're seeing is a discrepancy. The Russians said last week, for example, we hit Raqqa, which is an ISIS command center, and this techie little, probably 19-year-old bored high school kid, I don't know, went back and said, well, wait a minute, that can't be right, because here's the digital grid identifiers and here's the shadows, etc., and he's able to plot where they actually did hit. So in this modern day and age, if you're in the throwback era and you say, well, I'm going to commit a war crime, we're all just going to keep it quiet, good luck with that. Doesn't work that way. All right. My goal today is to give you just a quick overview of the big principles, then we're going to spend the next 5 weeks and apply these things. The big one is military necessity. That flows from your overarching strategic objectives. What's your goal? Then that flows into a military mission statement. What is my mission statement? Here's my mission statement. This is what I'm told to do. From that comes, in parlance, specified and implied tasks. Some things I'm specifically told to do, but just logically, if I'm specifically told to show up in this room at 9:30, what all's necessary implications of that? Well, it means I got to eat breakfast so I don't pass out. It means I need to actually prepare something to say. Right? Those are all the necessary implications. Okay, so when you flow this process, it gets all the way down to the ground level, and that's happened repeatedly. That process gives you military necessity. Why did we do whatever it was we intended to do? military necessity? What was the strategic purpose? What's the operational purpose? Because if you're just dropping bombs to be dropping bombs, or sending drones to kill people for no reason, for no military purpose, what do we call that? I call it murder. Yeah, it's stupid. It's a waste of taxpayer money. I call it murder. All right? It's a permissive body of law, but you've got to apply it in good faith under the what a reasonable person would do in those circumstances. Unnecessary suffering, we're not going to waste time on that. In a PhD level course, we could do a lot of this. It's basically an outdated concept. We kind of solved this problem in international law about 50 years ago. Okay? I do think there's the potential. Now, we've solved it for Western militaries that comply with the law. We have not solved this problem necessarily for ISIS and Hamas and other people who don't comply with the law. So you may see them doing things like putting glass fragments in bombs because they don't show up on x-rays, and you may see them doing things that do cause unnecessary suffering and therefore violate that principle. The big one is distinction, and we're going to do a lot on this next week. The idea that you have to distinguish between participants in the conflict and civilians at all times. The principle of distinction, and we already did proportionality. Here's the principle of distinction. The parties shall at all times distinguish between the civilian population and combatants, and between civilian objects and military objectives. And notice the language here. There's no exceptions. Shall direct their operations only against military objectives. Military part. That's the principle of distinction. And of course, terrorists, that's the core principle that they violate every time they do anything intentionally terroristic. They're intentionally targeting civilians. That's the whole point for a terrorist organization. So everything they do on an indiscriminate basis violates that principle of law. That's why you can say from the ground up a terrorist organization is not Hamas, Hezbollah, not complying with the law, Boko Haram. Okay? Because by definition, everything they're doing is targeting civilians, civilian objects, civilian personnel. Okay? And this is an example of the law. Even though it's a permissive body of law, there's no permissiveness built into the principle of distinction. See? So what's going to happen at your war crimes trial when you stand up and you say, yes, I know the principle of distinction, but it's a permissive zone, so I have autonomy to tinker with it based on the needs of the mission. What's going to happen? Seeing lots of head shaking. You're guilty. Because, here's why. Because the law of war builds in permissiveness every place it's appropriate. So if you're up against an area in the body of law that has no permissive zone built into it, you're never at liberty to invent your own. Okay? Now this is the exception. This is the exception. Almost every principle in the law of war has that zone of permissible discretion. You'll see things like when circumstances permit, when possible, lots and lots and lots of discretionary zone. But here's a rule, no discretionary space built in. All times, all place, direct your activities only against those people. Okay? And you got to be careful. This is Baghdad. This is Baghdad that night. Okay? Now that looks bad to the civilian eye. That looks terrible. But I assure you, each and every target carefully selected, gone through that process so that you're going through that. Commander, this is Baghdad with a different type of weapon system, different type of attack, and a commander, in this case a U.S. Marine commander, deciding based on the application of the principles, some things I'm going to strike, some things I'm not going to strike. And understand, for everything you don't strike, you're at some level elevating the law or the legal principles, the legal constraints above the safety even of your own soldiers, your own Marines. Because if I don't hit that with an area weapon from far off, two things are going to happen. Either they're going to leave, or we're going to have to go in and fight them face to face up close on the ground. Third option, of course, I find another way to target it that I can fit into the legal rubric. But that's my only options. Okay? And this is not a video game, right? In a video game, you'll have grandkids that play video games and get frustrated. You know, that new War Halo video game thing. If you get tired of the video game, you just turn it off. This is not a video game. This is reality. People are living and dying based on these decisions, and more importantly, at a fundamental level, you're either winning or losing. And that's, and not to be over dramatic about it, but that's why this stuff matters. Okay? People live and die by these decisions. So just a few quick things to kind of set us up for next week. The basic principle, of course, civilian objects, there's long listings of objects that are always protected. Hospitals, churches, the Louvre, etc. But what happens when the enemy misuses those, just like the mosques? What are they doing? When, let's assume that the reports are correct, that the Taliban were in fact using the hospital of Médecins Sans Frontières to conduct combatant activities. It's still highly uncertain. You never believe the first press reports. But let's assume that's true. What can we say about the Taliban? Or what could we say about the Iraqi insurgents putting weapons in mosques? That's a war crime. That's a war crime. But remember, the fundamental principle, just because the enemy commits the war crime, what does that mean for me? So now they've lowered the bar. I can do anything they're doing. Is that right? Why not? Why not? I mean, it seems common sense, right? If they're going to change the rules, we ought to be able to dial down and adjust. It's just a matter of equity. What's the problem with that? And your instinct says, no, that can't be right. What's the problem with that, though? It's our professional obligation. It's not displaceable. I can't displace it. It's not relative to what they're doing. You see? It's my professional moral, certainly, but more importantly, legal and professional. Okay? So, like it or not, our freedom of action to simply do whatever the enemy is doing, ISIS or Hamas or Hezbollah, just ask the Israelis how hard it is to fight in an urban zone when fighters on the ground have human shields. And I'll show you some pictures when we do the human shields of exactly what that looks like. And you can't say just kill them all. You've got to be very disciplined and professional. Another example. These are the swords in Baghdad. Supposedly, and I don't know if this is actually true, but I think it is because I've heard it enough places and I've heard it from enough Iraqis. This is the main parade ground in central Baghdad. Supposedly, those hands and the forearms were cast from Saddam Hussein's forearms. So those like giant Saddam hands holding these scimitars. At one point, we used this as a staging ground. Imagine that entire flat, nice surface covered with U.S. military equipment. We decided not to strike that target because of the symbolic value and the fact that there's really no military purpose to striking that, right? Except, I guess, you demoralize them and you kind of show them we're in charge. Well, they know we're in charge, right? They know we have overwhelming military power. We don't need to strike it to show that. Ergo, there's no military necessity. And the principle of distinction says we're always making that decision, what's appropriate, what's got military utility, what doesn't. No, we don't strike it. Okay? And it probably would have violated proportionality in any event. The Haditha Dam is the same thing. We looked at the Haditha Dam. We assessed the target package. Not going to hit it for a host of reasons. Okay? And that's why it was very important when, you may not remember this, one of the first things ISIS did in Iraq was take that dam back. So now ISIS is there. Do you bomb the dam? And you've got to make that decision. And the decision is, no, we're not going to bomb it, even though we could. We're going to go in and use ground forces to take that out. Yeah.
Who makes that decision?
Commanders. Commanders at all levels. Unless a politician takes it out of their hands as a matter of policy. But the problem is politicians, I hate to say this, I don't want to be political, but the politicians are just not very good lawyers. They're not. Many times they got all kinds of other dumb collateral consequences in mind. They're not good lawyers. And more importantly, when military commanders go to the politicians and say, here's my best military advice, more often than not, the politician doesn't want to hear it. And that's been a consistent problem over the last 20, 30 years. Now it's even harder in dealing with ISIS and Hamas and Hezbollah because the law itself is uncertain. So you're going to be able to forum shop and find a lawyer that would say one thing based on different assumptions and different facts, and then find another lawyer that would absolutely say something else. What are you going to do? You know, because remember, this stuff is criminally enforceable. See? And this is where the distinction between the permissive and restrictive bodies of law becomes so important. Okay? This is the Alfurtis bunker that I mentioned a while ago in Iraq in the first Gulf War. We hit it. Tragic mistake. You know, and what you got to step up and say, which is what we said, tragic mistake. If we'd known that, we wouldn't have hit it, but lawful, not criminal. Okay? Now, if we intentionally target that, knowing those things, whole different animal. You got to change your assumptions. In contrast, this is ISIS in Iraq. Or, I'm sorry, ISIS in Syria. This is Palmyra, Syria. Within the last few days, you may have seen the headlines. ISIS just destroyed those Roman arches. The Romans put those arches up in the 2nd century after defeating the Persians. Kind of ironic, isn't it? They went and defeated the precursors to the Iranians, and now ISIS has destroyed that, kind of opening the door back for Iranian influence back in Syria. I find that highly ironic. The thing at the top is the Temple of Baal. You know, I don't know if y'all are idol worshipers, you know, but if you were an idol worshiper, the Temple of Baal would mean a lot to you. It was on the UNESCO Cultural Protected Property list, and you can see what they did to it. Just destroyed the place. This is an example from Kosovo of, you see the church there, and you see a piece of military equipment. Now, this is a dumb bomb. This is a guided bomb, but it's older technology. So it's guided from the cockpit, not from the ground. There's no laser. It's just a different, older set of technology. The pilot here decided not to hit that target because he was worried about the church, and he was also making a snap assessment. It's really not that big a deal if I let that target escape in the macro terms. When he got back to base, this had been broadcast, and commanders were screaming that that pilot needed to be prosecuted for dereliction of duty. And what do you say? You fall back on you say it's a permissive body of law. That decision is mine and mine to make in the cockpit. Unless you've directly ordered me, target that thing no matter what consequences. That's my decision in the cockpit. And the higher level commander supported him in that decision. Even if they didn't like it, they had to support him because it's a permissive, discretionary body of law. Again, your basic principles, and this is the way it works. Military necessity, unnecessary suffering, distinction, and proportionality. The point is that they're all interconnected. Okay? They're all interrelated in this very tight, you can't take one and disentangle it from all of the others. They're all connected in very, very subtle, very powerful ways. The big thing, how many of y'all have heard this phrase, combatant? Well, I hope every one of you raises your hands because it's in the definition of distinction I just put on the screen a while ago. Yeah, I just showed you combatant. But what is a combatant? I want to explain combatant immunity. Again, a precursor to where we're going to go next week. Combatant immunity is the simple concept that says you are lawfully conducting hostilities. Okay? You're lawfully part of the armed conflict, and therefore, being lawfully part of the armed conflict, a whole set of rights and duties flow from that. All right? This is important because the first thing that happens, if you don't believe me, email me and I'll send you examples of this. The first thing that happens in every terrorist trial, the terrorist stands up. Anybody heard of Richard Reed, the shoe bomber? Attempted to that. Richard Reed did it. They all do it. Khawaja in the Canadian context, they all stand up and they say, you can't prosecute me because I'm a combatant. And as long as I'm a combatant, the definition of a combatant means I have a lawful right to participate in this conflict. Whatever I did, I'm cloaked. Everybody's seen, have you taken grandkids to go see the Harry Potter movies, or any of y'all like super Harry Potter fans? You know Harry Potter has this invisible cloak, right? The combatant immunity, think of it that way. It's a cloak that wraps around you and says, I have immunity. that flows from that legal status. I'm a combatant, and therefore a whole set of rights attached to me. But as in the common sense, where you have rights, what do you also have? Responsibilities and duties. So it's a twofold thing. You cannot be prosecuted for lawful acts of war while you are a combatant. Why? Because what do we do with combatants who kill lots of people? We put silver stars on their chest, right? Because they've done their job, they've complied with the law, they have the right to do that. When can a combatant be prosecuted? Only when they violate the law. It's a permissive body of law. You see that? What the law does is it defines the outer boundaries of permissible conduct. So what do we say to when ISIS stands up and says, I'm a combatant, you can't prosecute me. Yes, I bombed civilians, or yes, I bombed police, or whatever. I destroyed the arches in Palmyra. But you can't prosecute me because I'm a combatant. What do we say? No, we don't even get into this. That's the point. We don't even get into this analysis because they haven't even met the threshold determination. ISIS cannot be combatants. For technical reasons we'll talk about next week. I'll show you the law next week on this when we do targeting. But that's the point. Terrorists are not combatants. They're something else. They're not combatants. Everybody, you know, it's funny. Are you like a secret spy or something? Everybody's always worried about spies. Why are we so worried about spies? Are basically outside the law. And what I mean by that is everything a spy does is got this weird duality, this kind of schizophrenia. On the one hand, totally permissible in international law. Every country in the world has spies. We all know everybody has spies. The first time I walked into well, I can't tell you the story actually. Let me just say that I was in a particular setting in a multinational environment, and one of my friends got me by the elbow, which I kind of like my space. I was like, what are you grabbing me, getting in my space? And he says, stay close to me, because that person works for this country, and that person works for this country, and that person works for this country. He's showing me where the spies are. I'm like, okay, thanks, friend. Totally permissible under international law. Everybody does it. And there's lots of law that does apply to them. But at the very same time, totally illegal. Violative of domestic law around the world. So what a spy does is criminal under some domestic code. Point being, are spies combatants? No. Why? Because if you're a combatant in a permissive body, y'all know this, come on. Y'all know this. If you're a combatant, what have you got? This invisible cloak of broad combatant. I mean, this broad zone of protected, right? Protected activity. We call it combatant immunity in the law. That's why spies aren't combatants, because everything they do is criminal under some set of regime or other. Typically domestic law. A spy in Russia can jump up and down all day long and say, I'm a spy, I've been a spy for 50 years, you can't prosecute me. And what are the Russians going to say? Yet. All right? Quick question.
What about an adolescent throwing rocks or Molotov cocktails?
Not a combatant. Not a combatant. We're going to learn next week. The technical term is direct participation. I'm going to do all this next week. Direct participation in hostilities. They're not combatants, so they don't have the right to throw rocks. But here's the key thing, just to review. There's no test. I should give you a test, actually. You have to buy me a cup of coffee if you don't get this the right answer. Because the Palestinian kid throwing rocks is not a combatant, option A, they have a lawful right to throw rocks. Option B, they have no lawful right to throw rocks. How many folks say A? Stone them. B, they've got no lawful right to throw rocks. Why? They're not a combatant. Because they're not a combatant, do they have a permissible zone of discretionary conduct that allows them a broad range of discretion? No. Now here's the trick. It's not a trick question. This is deep, deep review. This is, in the education business, what you'd say third order review. Third order application. And I'm going to put you on the spot since you asked the question. What body of law applies to Hamas kid throwing rocks? Because he's not a combatant. We know that. He doesn't have that zone of permissible discretion granted from the law of war. So I've already given you the answer. What body of law applies? Human rights law. You see? That means if I'm going to target that kid, who bears the burden of proof? I do. Is it a restrictive or permissive rule? Hey, we're going to get along just fine, people. We're going to get along just fine. If you get those basic things, you're exactly where we need to be for today. Because we're going to come back to these things, and the terrorists, you see, the terrorists want to artificially inject themselves, artificially, and I would say inappropriately, into that combatant characterization. Why do they want to do that? Oh, come on. I can't hear. I got bad ears. Sorry? Right, but why? Why do they want that cloak of combatant immunity? Yes, this is my title. I am a combatant. Therefore? Right, I've got this permissible zone of discretion to do all of these things. And you can't, kind of like a teenager. Nanny, nanny, boo, boo. You can't prosecute me. What I've done is presumed lawful unless, in a combatant law of war setting, you can point to some circumstances that indicate that I acted inappropriately or inconsistently with that underlying body of law. That's combatant immunity. And it matters because, here's why it matters. Let me just sort of give you a teaser. Every drone strike we do, typically not against combatants. When can you kill a combatant? I mean, combatants can kill lawfully. When can we kill them? As long as you're a combatant, when can you be killed? When are you in danger? As long as you're a combatant, right? Combatant immunity is a double-edged sword, right? So can you kill a combatant in their pajamas? Good time. Can you kill them in the chow line when they're holding their food? Yeah. Harder question, can you kill them when they're home on leave? I don't know about that. Sure you can.
You wouldn't know if they were on leave or not.
That's right. Well, you would. I mean, you find this combatant. I find General Yamashita at home with his family. The military advantage of killing General Yamashita while he's a combatant is very high. Osama bin Laden, you could put him in that category. But here's the point. And this is where you get into this other area, which we're going to talk about next week. When you are a combatant, you are fully targetable, so what do? You change your status, right? I'm fully targetable because I'm a combatant, meaning I've got that right and the duty. So fine. I mean, if you're a coward, you shoot yourself in the leg. So all of a sudden you're not a combatant. What are you now? You're sick and wounded, and there's a whole body of law that says people that are sick and wounded are not combatants anymore, therefore they can't lawfully be killed. And at the same time, you've got this whole set of affirmative duties to protect them and take care of them, etc. Prisoners of war, the same thing. So the question comes up all the time, were Al-Qaeda prisoners at Guantanamo prisoners of war? See the logic? See the flow? If you started out as a combatant, you can be if you didn't start out as a combatant in the first place, you can't be a prisoner of war because you never had combatant immunity in the first place. Ergo, you had nothing to lose. See that? And the argument then would be you were a civilian the whole time. Or you would say, what's the synonym for civilian? Non-combatant, good. Unlawful participant in hostilities, there's your Hamas kid, Palestinian throwing rocks. Unlawful participant, unlawful belligerent. Now here's my last thing. This is your test to go home today. And we'll pick up here next week on targeting. When the United States Congress passes the Military Commissions Act, and they use the phrase unlawful combatant. You hear it in the media all the time. You see it. You've heard it in policy speeches all the time. Has anybody ever thought to question that? Who's heard the phrase unlawful combatant? Next time you hear that, I want you to throw something at your TV. Now throw something soft, mind you. What's the problem with the phrase unlawful combatant? It's a complete, yeah, I love this guy. George is on the ball. George's going to have to sit in the back and let somebody else talk next week. But he's exactly right. It's a complete oxymoron, right? How do you know you're a combatant? Because the law operates to give you that status, and with that status, remember, I think it was you that said it, I forget you didn't tell me your name. Dee Dee. Dee Dee said this, with that status comes a whole bundle of rights, but also a whole bundle of duties and responsibilities. Okay? Bestowed to you by virtue of the law. So when you say you're an unlawful combatant, you see why that makes no sense at all? You're either a combatant or you're not. It's like being a grandparent. You're either a grandparent or you're not. There's no middle ground. Okay? You can't stumble into accidentally being a grandparent. Right? So the phrase unlawful combatant in legal terms makes zero sense. It is a complete oxymoron. And next week when we do targeting, we're going to look at all the other vocabulary of what you could be. Okay? Now, I meant to pass around the sheet. I'll do it next week of email addresses. So if you want, if you want more reading or more information or more stuff, believe me, I got boatloads of it. You can read to your heart's content. I'd tell you to start reading the book, though. That's a good place to start. All right? See y'all next week.